much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
In the last half hour, the US Senate has found President Trump not guilty of abuse of power and the obstruction of Congress in his historic impeachment trial.
I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
And all this has rocked financial markets around the world. The worst sell-off on Wall Street
hearing
since
in the last few moments that the Prime Minister has been taken to hospital. Our political editor, Beth Rigby.
Protesters here in D.C. have gathered near the White House throughout the day, and we just learned President Trump was moved to the White House bunker on Friday night.
A show of solidarity with those in the United States and across the world.
My country, my country.
Hey, Kelly, that's right. Google in Silicon Valley now at large. They were early to send workers home. Now Google's the first to tell employees you don't need to come back for a year.
Pressures for a solution are immense, especially in Japan. The delayed Olympics are due to be held in Tokyo next summer, and they depend on a vaccine.
Joe Biden has won the American presidential election.
The FA chairman, Greg Clark, made a series of gaffes at a parliamentary hearing today.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Good. Once again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Adam Honeysett-Watts. I'm a co-chair of the PRCA Corporate Group. I'm also the founder and director at Do Different, a new public affairs and communications offering. In the spirit of doing things a little bit differently, we wanted to keep this session but also engaging. And that's why we're grateful to our creative partner, Westminster Digital, for putting together this excellent video. So thank you very much. Just so you're aware, the Zoom call is being recorded and will be made available on the PRCA's YouTube channel shortly afterwards. I'm sure most of you already know this, but those interested in getting involved, the PRCA is the world's largest professional PR body, and members are encouraged to explore the 45 or so groups, this being one of them. If you are a member or you do become one in the future, make sure you request to join this group so that you receive invitations to our, hopefully, in-person events next year. Also follow us on Twitter. It's at PRCA_corporate. Now, I know I'm biased. However, when some functions such as digital or internal, they rise and fall in terms of where they are in the pecking order. Corporate reputation management consistently remains among, if not at the top of the league, especially this year. So without further ado, let's focus on the topic at hand. When should business take a stance? Now, you've just seen that video, or you saw it earlier on, where we had a snapshot of some of the key events that happened in 2020, including which organizations were vocal and how they responded to those major political events. So, for example, we saw Ben & Jerry's and Sainsbury's. They spoke out pretty vocally in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement protests. And just this month, we saw Aldi opting to showcase the NHS rainbow flag in its Christmas advert. We've also seen some of those words being bandied around on social media by the public, especially on social media, to describe their responses, from being woke or being based, and things such as brand and employee activism. Now, I also run the Conservatives in Communications networking group, and while many of our supporters are proactive in terms of following and addressing the big issues internally, they're very much more conservative than the brands that we just highlighted when it comes to talking about things externally. Like them, I approach this by advising organizations to ask 3 or 4 basic questions. First of all, what is the purpose of a business? Secondly, will taking a stand negatively or positively impact our purpose? Third, will taking a stand hinder or the future ability to attract or retain customers? And lastly, does this issue rise to the level of a core issue? So should your business take a stance or not? That's really up to you. Sometimes the answer will be yes. More often or not, it will be no. But before you rush into things, I do advise to look at those 4 questions that we just went through. To explore other insights, we've got a short panel discussion for you today, and then an audience Q&A. So please put your questions into the Q&A box at the points, and we'll get through to those in about half an hour from now. So I'm joined by Natasha Jones. She is the Head of Communications and Policy at Funding Circle. The Funding Circle is a lending platform that matches investors with money, with small businesses to fund their next step. Paul Holmes, the journalist, not Paul Holmes, the MP. He is the founder and chair of Provoke. He's been writing about public relations for more than 25 years. And last, but by no means least, my fellow co-chair and fellow UEA alumni, Rebecca Donnelly. Rebecca is a senior partner at Tytopia. She is also a non-executive director of the Tech Talent Charter, a movement to drive diversity and inclusion in the UK tech sector. And with that, I'll hand over to Rebecca.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Adam. And thank you to everybody who's joined us here this afternoon, particularly our guests, Natasha and Paul. So I think after that introduction, I wanted to just get straight into it and come to you first, Natasha, and just bluntly come out and ask it. Should companies take a stand on social issues? What do you think?
Well, thanks for having me along this afternoon. I think the short answer is yes, but cautiously. It's a topic that's pretty close to my heart. Funding Circle's a mission-oriented business set up in the aftermath of the last financial crisis. Didn't expect to have such an enormous crisis so soon after. They said it was once in a lifetime. But we were set up to try and play a part in helping to solve a big societal issue, which was getting funds to small businesses where they were struggling through more traditional channels. And I think that mission has been really important at building loyalty, both internally with our staff, but also externally with customers. So yes, I think that there is merit to taking a stand, but as Adam outlined, doing it cautiously, I think is advised. We saw in the summer in the video, you referenced the Black Lives Matter movement, and in the summer we saw lots of companies very quickly put out statements. And the question that I kept kind of asking myself when I saw another statement go up was, had they really done the work internally and the deep soul searching that's required to back up what they were saying, and was what they were saying going to go down well internally if actually the actions weren't really there, or externally with their customers as well, if what they were saying wasn't really aligned to the customer experience. So yes, I think that there is definitely a lot to gain from taking a stand. The loyalty point that I mentioned, I think, can be really powerful. And can help organisations in terms of their strategic goals, and also bringing it back to the bottom line. But you don't want to be caught out, and you definitely don't want to be out there taking a big stand on something that it doesn't feel substantial because you haven't spent the time really soul searching, especially I think on issues around diversity and inclusion.
So I'm going to come back to that point in a moment, but first just one more question for you, Natasha, just to kind of pick up on what you said. So how do you then decide as an organisation? You mentioned that Funding Circle is all about supporting small businesses. How do you decide what issues you're going to come out publicly in support of?
Yeah, I think Adam came up with some really great tips in his intro. To add to that and build on it, I was thinking about this morning. I was going to say you have to be bulletproof, but I actually, as I've reflected on it through the day, I actually don't think you necessarily have to be totally bulletproof. But I think because actually, particularly in the D&I space, the issues that that organisations are really grappling, have really started to grapple with this year, but also over the last particularly 5 years with the Me Too movement. They're big societal long-term issues that are not going to change overnight, and therefore I don't necessarily think that you don't need to have all of the answers, but I do think that you need to demonstrate that you've done a decent amount of thinking about it, and that you have started to put actions in, started to take action and demonstrate that those actions are moving in the right direction. So I don't think that so going back to I kind of did a U-turn. I don't think you necessarily have to be bulletproof, but I do think you need to kind of show that you've put some action behind what you're saying. And then the second thing is, how is what you're going to take a stand on going to go down with all of your stakeholders, whether that's your staff internally, and how does that align with your values? Because if what you take a stand on is actually completely misaligned with the values of the organization, then that's not going to go down too well. And then similarly, on the external side with your customers, if you've set out with your business strategy, I suppose in our case to help small businesses, but then we take a stand on something which is completely different to that, and how's that going to go down with your customers? So I think there's definitely a piece around aligning it to your strategy and your mission and your values. And then the third thing I'd say is you're probably going to need to prioritize, because you can't if you're going to do it really properly, which I think is kind of brings it back to the first point, that you've got to have the action behind what you're saying, then you're not going to be able to tackle every single thing in one go, and so there's going to need to be some prioritization. And so maybe that's how do you align the issues that you're going to take a stand on, how do you prioritize the issues you're going to take a stand on, and that probably needs to be then aligned back to point 2, which is what are the ones that do have the most synergy with your strategy and your values.
Thank you. So, Paul, if I can come to you now, thinking about this from an external point of view, how this looks to the outside world when brands come out and take a position on issues. There's 2 things I wanted to raise here. And one of the cases I found so fascinating this year was when Brian Armstrong, the CEO of cryptocurrency exchange Coinbase, came and put out a statement that Coinbase would not take a stand on any political or social issues, and they didn't allow their employees to do so either, because it distracted from the mission of the company. He put out this statement in September, I think, and invited his staff, if they didn't agree with him, the opportunity to take voluntary redundancy, and 30% of the business did. So that's quite an extreme impact of not taking a stance. And then we've also got, as you raised there, Natasha, companies kind of really quick to sort of jump on the bandwagon and put out statements, put rainbow flags on their Twitter accounts. Paul, how can companies do this in an authentic way? What are the risks of either not taking a stand or coming across as inauthentic when they take a public position on these issues?
Right. I think that the first thing that companies have to think about in this situation is their values, their mission, and if they've made an attempt to articulate a clear mission and a clear set of values, what do those values tell them about whatever the issue in question might be? I find it, for example, completely incongruous that companies that have diversity and inclusion as a mission could find a way not to take a stand on an issue like Black Lives Matter. If you say that diversity matters to you and that's something that you're communicating to your employees and your customers, then to fail to take a position, I would argue, is unconscionable, and a betrayal of your values and your identity. For me, this comes back to some things that I've always believed about public relations as a discipline. The first is that public relations is exactly what it says, that the management of relationships. And the second is that relationships are based on behavior, and that that behavior has to be driven by something other than simply the desire to make a profit. I got into writing about public relations at about the same time that Milton Friedman was insisting that the only social responsibility of the corporation was to make money. And First of all, I find that a profoundly unhelpful statement in terms of what we're talking about here, because I don't think that I don't think that that necessarily helps us answer whether being socially responsible in fact contributes to the bottom line. There's a lot of evidence today that it does. And B, how you balance making money this quarter with building a sustainable business. And I would argue that building a sustainable business is very much dependent on relationships. It's dependent on your relationships with employees, it's relationships with consumers, relationships with your communities, and relationships with the society in which you operate. And all of those people believe in things. You know, I've never had a relationship with a person who didn't believe in something. And so I actually find the Coinbase argument, you know, not to be neutral, but to be patently offensive. You're an organization functioning in the world, and you're saying, you're saying you don't give a, the word I was going to use is unsuitable for a good goddamn. That to me is taking a stance, and it's an offensive stance. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to build on that to ask, with so many of the issues, and I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this topic for me at the moment is so many of these public issues on the public agenda have become very, very polarized this year, with both sides of the debate seem more amplified and more divided than ever. So what risks, doesn't that bring risks to a business of taking a particular position on one of those things? Aren't you going to alienate some of your staff, some of your partners, some of your customers? How can a company navigate that?
First of all, I think you've got to balance your appetite for risk with the knowledge that there's also opportunity risk, that doing nothing today is a risk. I mean, I got drawn into this discussion, as you'll recall, by just being a little quick on my keyboard when I saw the topic, because I do believe that not taking a stance is simply not an option. In other words, if you don't take a position on the issue, you are definitionally in favor of the status quo. So if you don't, I mean, you know, if you don't take a stance on Me Too, then, you know, you're pretty much in favor of misogyny. And I'm sorry, that's just how I and a lot of people out there in the world are going to interpret your action. But the second thing is, you know, public relations, this is another key thing that I believe about our discipline. Public relations isn't about making everybody like you. Public relations is about articulating what your company stands for and why. And core to that are things like empathy and integrity and courage. And part of that is having the courage to realize that not everything you say is going to appeal to every single member of your constituency. But that doesn't mean that you come up with the blandest, most inoffensive values and the most bland, inoffensive ad campaigns and the most bland, inoffensive public affairs strategies that you can in order to keep everybody on side. It means you have to understand very clearly what you believe in, what your values are, and try and match them as much as you can with the values of your employees and consumers.
So let's get a bit practical then, Natasha, if we come back to you. So, you know, we've got a lot of corporate comms people in-house and agency listening into this today. If they're grappling with these issues, they're looking at what's going on in the outside world, they're starting to get questions from their team, you know, they're starting to be challenged by the media, their senior team are debating these things. What are the practical steps they need to go through? What are the things that need to be considered to feel confident that you know, what their business is taking a stand on supports their values, and B, that they're doing it in an authentic way and not, as you say, just kind of slapping a black square on their Twitter account and thinking that does the job. What are those kind of steps they can go through? Can you give us some advice?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the things that we've been really focused on internally, although we haven't talked about it too much externally, because for the very reason that I said at the beginning, is that I think it has to start internally, and I think you have to have that conversation with your, well, as senior management. Does this fit with our strategy and our values? And then if the answer is yes, and particularly if it's got a D&I lens and it's people related, then I think you need to have a dialogue your staff internally and create an environment where people feel able to come forward and talk about it, talk about their experiences, talk about how, you know, their ideas for how we move things forward, so it's not too top down. We set up, myself and our Europe MD set up the Women's Network a few years ago, and that was really off the back of the gender pay gap reporting that had come in, where we'd you know, looked at the data properly for the first time, and you know, we did have we didn't have as many women in senior management positions as we would have liked, and you know, we're fintech, financial services and technology, both historically quite male dominated sectors, but rather than just saying, okay, senior management take this seriously and therefore, you know, we care about it, there needed to be some kind of grassroots engagement across the organisation. So I think there needs to be a kind of top-down, bottom-up approach, so that you kind of meet in the middle, hopefully, I guess, is the ideal. So yeah, we have a women's network that creates a space where, you know, people across the organisation could talk about these issues, and we've since used that model so we've got a Let's Talk About Race group and a Circle of Pride group as well. You notice that there's some circle analogies there, being funding circle. I think, you know, creating an environment within the organisation that people can talk about these issues is really key. And then the conversation with senior management, like I said at the beginning, is, you know, is this something that we really care about? I think, as Paul said, you can't really be an organisation and say we don't care about diversity and inclusion these days. There's so much evidence out there that shows that, you know, having a diverse workforce, you know, is good for the business, is good for the bottom line, is good for society. So, but you don't, like I said right at the beginning, you don't really want to go out and say, we care about these things, but you haven't really thought about it internally. So I think there's a kind of whole piece in terms of you know, kicking off that piece of thinking and then engaging with the workforce on that. And we didn't put out a statement about Black Lives Matter in the summer. We didn't put anything out on our website, but that doesn't mean that we don't care about it deeply. We do. We just felt that thinking was, you know, and that work was more important to do first, in order for our people to feel like, you know, that we really did take it seriously. Yeah. And then in future, if we go out and talk about more publicly, you know, some of the work that we've done, then hopefully staff will feel that is genuinely authentic, because we've spoken to them first and we've engaged them first on it.
I think that's a really, really important point there, that of course there's a big difference between taking a stance and actually taking action, right? And taking action needs to be the first thing you do, I think, before you go out and publicly take a position on something.
And the thing is that you in the end, if you do it properly, you'll get known for it anyway. So I don't think that you necessarily even need to go out and shout about it. I mean, obviously that there will be a role for comms people to tell the story in the right way, of course, but ultimately I think, you know, the organisations that do this stuff really well, in the end, they get known for it because they've started in the right place and it's substantial.
Yeah. There's obviously a very, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think there's a real sliding scale of sort of degrees of involvement, from, you know, the very hollow, performative kind of communication that we saw from Pepsi a couple of years ago with the Kendall Jenner ad, which, you know, I think we can all agree sort of missed the mark and came across as sort of empty virtue signaling, to something more substantial like Unilever last year in the US got very involved with, this is going to sound slightly arcane, and hopefully there are people on the call who'll be familiar with this issue, but in the Black community in the US, in the African American community in the US, hair is a very political topic, and Unilever got involved with that because it's core to their business, right? they make shampoos, among other things, to actually pass laws in, I think it was ultimately 13 states, that banned hair discrimination. So you couldn't be fired for having dreadlocks or an afro or whatever it happened to be. Now, that's a step up in that you are actively advocating and using your power on behalf of your consumers. And then it goes all the way, I would say, to, you know, an organization like PayPal, which had been planning to build a new headquarters in North Carolina before North Carolina passed a number of laws that were perceived as being hostile to the LGBTQ community. And PayPal made a very public decision not to relocate to North Carolina and to look elsewhere for its headquarters, to signal to its employees that it was willing to take a stand on their behalf against something that many of them were deeply uncomfortable with. And that's sort of a sliding scale from, you know, as I say, empty virtue signaling, all the way to we as a company are prepared to go through a fairly significant degree of inconvenience and cost in order to make it clear that we believe what we say we believe. And obviously, from my perspective, the latter is much more powerful and does much more to build a relationship than the former.
So there've been a few examples of some companies that have attempted to do it and been very controversial, and you could probably still argue for both sides. So one really famous example was Gillette's "The Best a Man Can Be" campaign from early last year. There's also kind of a very famous long-standing BP Beyond Petroleum ad series, which kind of ran over many years, but ultimately did nothing to kind of enhance their brand reputation. What do you think companies like that got wrong, Paul, or did they get it wrong?
Well, look, okay, this is
slightly different scenarios there, but yeah.
That's right. This is my overly simplistic take on both of them, because first of all, I'm a journalist and overly simplistic is what I do, and secondly, we don't have a huge amount of time. BP was a marketing campaign that started as a marketing campaign, which is absolutely the wrong place to start something like that. And I would argue that if somebody who was really good at public relations as opposed to marketing had been in charge of it, the first thing you would have said was, okay, how do we communicate to our employees that we're moving beyond petroleum, and what new behaviors from our employees are necessary? How do we make sure that our culture drives the kind of behavior that will help us move beyond petroleum, part of which would have been, we're going to focus on environmental safety, health goals, and reward people for focusing on environmental goals, rather than just focusing on how much oil can we extract from the Gulf, as it turned out. And so it would have started in a completely different place, and you would have gotten your organization aligned behind that vision and that mission long before you started talking about it to your consumers. There's nothing wrong with saying we aspire to be this kind of organization, but claiming that you've done it when you're really just thinking about how do we start this journey makes no sense. And that was the BP campaign.
Right.
I don't think the Gillette campaign actually is one that I spent a lot of time looking at early in the year, because the social media backlash to what they called We Believe, which was a campaign against toxic masculinity, for people who don't necessarily remember it like you and I do. The backlash was swift and it was harsh, and it got sort of the men's right / incel movement very agitated. But the reality is that everything I've seen from Unilever talking to their brand and public relations people suggests that it was a very, very successful campaign. That ultimately it built stronger relationships with their consumers. And yes, there were some people who hated it, but there were a lot more people who really respected the company for taking a stance. And it was what I talked about earlier: empathy, integrity, courage.
Well, we'll
respect that.
we're going to move to, I think we're going to take some questions from our audience and people who are listening in this afternoon. So if you've got any, please fire them over. But I think just before we do that, to kind of wrap up, I think like what I've heard on this call, to summarize it, that not taking a stance is taking a stance, essentially. When you're working out as a company or advising a client on what to take a stance on, it's absolutely fundamental to embed it in the values of what you do as a business. That you must take action, not just take a stance. You need to base it in something real that the company's actually doing. And to your last point there, Paul, get PR people and comms people involved in the conversation early on. Does that kind of cover it as some key takeaways, or is there anything you'd add there?
That works for me.
Brilliant. Well, so Adam, I don't know whether we've had any questions from the people who have joined us this afternoon, and whether we wanted to take a couple of those.
Yeah, sure. So I've got one here, probably for Paul. So it's from Anonymous. So you mentioned social media backlash re Gillette. How much harder do you think social media has made it for companies to take a stance on some of the big issues?
I don't know that it's necessarily made it more difficult for companies that understand these issues really well. But I think that if you're a neophyte to this, and if you a lot of CEOs in particular just feel like, let's keep our head down and try and stay out of trouble is the right approach, then yeah, that can be difficult. I mean, I think you have to have a certain amount of courage to deal with the social media background. Now, I'd argue that courage is part of leadership, and that if you don't, if you're not prepared to lead, you're probably in the wrong job, whether it's a CEO's job or a PR person's job. But I think you have to have a sense of proportion and understand that the loudest voices on Twitter are not necessarily representative of the entire Twitterverse, for example, and that actually the Twitterverse is not necessarily is not necessarily reflective of your employee base and your stakeholder base.
Hard to remember that sometimes.
I think we've seen more recognition of that, or at least it feels to me like we have in the last 12 months. I think there's generally been more of a push to encourage people to be kind on social media, and I think that's a backlash against a lot of the trolling that we've unfortunately seen in recent years. And I mean, that's not to say that people are necessarily trolling over these big societal issues, but people do kind of get behind the keyboard, and you start to see some quite nasty behaviours sometimes on social media. I think companies, individuals have recognised that more in the last 12 months, and actually dealing with a bit of a pinch of salt sometimes, like you said, Paul, is and recognising that it's not representative necessarily of all of the people that you care about is actually quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen enough examples of companies that have sort of weathered an initial storm. We mentioned Gillette. You could also mention Nike with their Colin Kaepernick campaign in the US, where they were happy to showcase an athlete who'd taken a controversial political stance. People, the first couple of days, people were on social media burning their sneakers, which always seems to me to be a peculiar form of protest, but whatever. But the reality is that, once you've weathered those initial couple of days, typically the angry people go away, and you're left with a much better relationship, because you've demonstrated commitment. And I just think we generally respect companies that say what they believe and believe what they say. Conviction is an incredibly compelling character trait, and you don't see enough of it in corporations.
We've got a lot of questions that have come in, which is good. So we've got something from Oliver Kirby. He says, what advice would you give when trying to convince senior executive CEOs about when they need to take a stance and when they should? Perhaps Natasha.
We started with the data, particularly on D&I, because I think that's really powerful. And actually, initially when the gender pay gap reporting came in, I thought it was potentially quite blunt, and I wasn't completely convinced, in what it could do. But as we went through that process as an organisation, it was really powerful, because it made everyone kind of confront the scale of the challenge, really, and having that cold hard data in front of you it really helps with that. So I think that's a really good place to start with senior management, and then I think coming back to it really regularly. It can't just be something that you talk about once and go, okay, right, job done. We did our gender pay gap reporting, and so now we just kind of get back to it. It's got to be something regularly, I think, on the agenda for senior management to talk about, and make sure that it's revisited, and any goals that you're setting are, you genuinely hold your feet to the fire and say, okay, well, actually we didn't meet that. Why didn't we meet that? And really dig into that. And it's okay, I think, if you don't necessarily always meet the targets. Like I said, these are long-term societal challenges, which don't get solved overnight. So, but actually being able to come back to it on a regular basis and track against how you're doing, and be honest with each other about how you're doing is really important as well, I think.
I really hate to be the guy who argues against data, because I actually love data, and I think our embrace of data as a field.
I was qualitative and quantitative.
But I also feel like we should be arguing more. I'm going to say data can be helpful, but I think the starting point shouldn't be data. The starting point should be values. And I go back to something that happened when I just arrived in the US in like 1990. And it involved a company called Dayton Hudson, which is it's a retail company that has since evolved into Target. And Dayton Hudson had for years been giving, through its corporate philanthropic arm, money to Planned Parenthood of America, which is very active in women's reproductive health and provides abortions. And somebody at the company had spotted this in their list of charitable giving and decided to head off any controversy by cutting the grant to Planned Parenthood. So they cut their grant to Planned Parenthood. Women across the US began to cut up their credit cards and send them back to Dayton Hudson in outrage. Dayton Hudson reacted to that by reinstating the grant to Planned Parenthood, whereupon evangelical Christians across America started cutting up their credit cards and sending them back to Dayton Hudson. And you sort of had this image of your head of somebody at Dayton Hudson weighing the Christian credit cards against the women's credit cards and trying to make a decision of which group they could afford to piss off and which group they had to play nice with, depending on how the scales balanced on that day. That's a really unseemly look for a corporation. And at the same time, Levi Strauss was going through something very similar, because they defunded Boy Scouts of America because Boy Scouts of America discriminates against gays and atheists. And they were very clear. We're not doing this for commercial reasons. We're not doing it to please one group and not please another. We're doing it because non-discrimination is a fundamental part of our culture. And I think in that, those two cases showed me that understanding what your values are is much more powerful than saying, okay, 51% of our consumers support this. But if tomorrow 51, and I know this is not what you were saying, Natasha, I don't want to be really reductive about your position statement on this or create some sort of straw man, so forgive me. But I think in that regard, values trump data. Understanding what you stand for and being prepared to stand for it is a little more important than just counting the voices.
Shall we see if we've got time for a couple of last questions?
Yeah, I was going to say we've got quite a lot, but there's two that I wanted to raise. One perhaps for Rebecca and myself to answer. It says, when talking about corporate purpose, so we are talking about corporate purpose, but how do agencies who have multiple clients with opposing commercial aims strike the right balance? And the other question I wanted to go through, and perhaps for Paul and Natasha, do you have any thoughts or advice for global companies who have large markets in countries where culture and or government is openly against some of the issues which might be supported in the West? I don't know, Rebecca, have you had any thoughts on the first point for advice for the agency?
On the first question about how large agencies reconcile this, it's an extremely good question, and it's something that I've, my last agency, we represented the NHS, and we also represented fast food brands, but I think what it came down to is the agency itself needs to have values and what it believes in. And those are going to dictate, they should dictate the kind of clients that that agency takes on. And that doesn't necessarily determine that your clients all have to believe in the same thing as you, but it just determines the kind of work you do and what you believe in, what you believe your purpose is as a PR and communications firm. So I think certainly, we talked about that in my last agency, we talk about it in my current agency. We don't take on every client. And that's a luxury position to be in. But I think if you start to really compromise on actually what's the purpose of your business and what are you here to do, then you get yourself into a whole world of trouble. So it's not an easy question to answer, but I think
which kind of links back to the other question, and perhaps Paul can weigh in. It's about if you are one of those clients and you've got differences of geography, etc. How would you go about advising them? Paul, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, just to add a thought to the last question, I think it's entirely, I think it depends on the kind of work you're doing, not the kind of client you're doing it for. I think you can do ethical work for oil companies and you can do unethical work for Greenpeace, right? It's not the nature of the client, it's the nature of the work that makes it ethical or otherwise. On the cultural thing, I think you have to, look, the problem with this is that it's not a yes or no answer, right? Like a lot of things in our business, it's about balancing competing ethics and demands. I think you have to be respectful of local cultures and markets where you operate, but I think you also have to have a set of, and I keep coming back to the word values, principles. You have to have a set of core principles that you will not violate. So if you believe in inclusion, for example, then you can't endorse or support or appear to be on the side of homophobia, even in countries where homophobia is a natural part of the culture or openly endorsed by the dominant religion or whatever. You have to have principles that supersede the local expediency in those cases. And every company is going to decide what are the core principles that they can't violate on a market by market basis, and where it's what it defines as being an issue of local cultural respect. But hopefully, those things, there are black and white issues as well as gray areas. I know that's a really unhelpful answer.
No, I think that's a really good way to end, and we are on the 5 o'clock. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much to all of the participants, to the panelists, the PRCA, and once again to Westminster Digital. If you have any questions, obviously afterwards, just ping us on social media, and I'm sure we can come back to you separately.